Jordan Peterson did a New Year's question and answer video, and two of the questions touched on church, and I thought those two questions touched on church in such an important and dramatic way, I wanted to make a video about them. So basically, Jordan Peterson suggests church might be helpful, but can't stand it himself because of the lying pastors. And he said that's probably more about him than about anything else, and I want to respect those comments. But as a pastor, I wanted to touch on them. So he made the video, and Victoria Circus did a lovely job outlining the questions, and I really appreciated that. That was a completely helpful comment. Now Peterson on church, basically my initial observations were that he absorbed the Cold War assumptions about church functions. And if you listen to Peterson's Maps of Meaning course, you know that his journey in many ways grew out of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Peterson's about my age, and so he was trying to figure out why these two civilizations are putting the world in peril over these ideas. And so his Maps of Meaning course is basically his work to sort that out. And what he does along the way in here, especially with respect to the lying pastors comment, is he articulates one of the central struggles of mythos versus material. And this is really in many ways seeded by Jesus in the Gospels and the early church fight over whether the Gentiles can be included and whether they must in fact be circumcised and if they must obey the dietary laws. And when Jesus says it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you clean or unclean, but what comes out of your heart. And this really blew up in the Protestant Reformation in the fights over sacraments and the priesthood and vestments. So let's dive in. Let's take a look at let's take a look at the questions and answers.
Can we take the biblical, Andrew Wells asks, can we take the biblical story seriously enough without also keeping biblical traditions? What's the psychological impact of group gathering? Church going?
These are two separate questions, and they're really quite separate. And so the first question is, can we take the Bible seriously? And that gets into kind of the central struggle around Peterson. And when he says biblical traditions, boy, we could have a long conversation about that. And then the second is the psychological value of groups.
I think we could take the biblical stories seriously enough, but I don't think that it's particularly easy. The traditions bind the community together. Now, I'm saying that, and I don't go to church, and the reason I don't go to church is because, well, it drives me crazy, to speak frankly. I haven't been able to sit in a situation like that ever since I was, well, ever, really. That's really the truth of it, ever. I'm not convinced that that's a good thing, because I do believe, and I've had good conversations about this with Jonathan Pageau, I do believe that communal return to the source of the community's ethics is actually a necessary thing. And maybe I'm atoning for my past sins by doing these biblical lectures at the moment, which is something that's communal. So, and then because there's also something about going where a bunch of other people are to reaffirm your commitment to the good that you're all aiming at, that's got some power in it. And I don't think that that's something that we should forego. I think it's dangerous. I mean, look, even if you're cynical about church, and I guess I would put myself in that category, it's certainly the case that communal church going in the 1950s, say, provided the average person with at least an hour a week where they were contemplating, no matter how poorly, the purpose of ethics in life and the idea of a higher purpose and a higher meaning in life. And you got to think that spending an hour a week thinking about that is better than never doing it at all. So I don't know how that tradition can be revivified in a meaningful way, but I really do think it's a catastrophe that we've lost it, because we don't have a center, an ethical center that holds our community together, and the consequence of that is that we're fragmenting quite badly. So,
and I think that's a classic Peterson answer. It's self-critical. It's very honest and transparent. And again, these are some of the qualities that I think have really brought a lot of people to appreciate and love. Now let's listen to the lying answer.
You said you don't go to church because the pastors are lying most of the time. What do you mean by lying in this instance? I don't, my experience has been that they don't believe what they're saying. That's what it sounds like to me. That's what I mean by lying. They say these things and they tell people to believe them, but they don't believe them themselves. And so, and they're actually not listening to them. They're not listening to what they're saying. That's the thing that I've always had this experience in church. And there's lots of other reasons I don't go to church. And a lot of them have to do with me, not with the insufficiency of church. But, you know, a lot of the scriptural writings really have really hit me. And I do understand some of them, I think, to some degree. And it's kind of painful to hear them utilized by people who are doing it formulaically or without conviction, or even worse, knowing full well that they don't believe what they're saying. And so that's what I mean by lying.
Now, it's important to remember that as Peterson himself has talked about, his background is in the United Church of Canada, which is a large, I don't know how large it is, which is a mainline Protestant denomination, and this is going to get us into this entire history of the church in the Cold War and after the Cold War, and then the culture war and the split and identity politics on the left and the and conservatism on the right. All of this is bound into this answer that Peterson is giving right here. Now, I'm not going to go through the answer, but basically I think what Peterson offers here is a quick, low-resolution history of post-Cold War Protestantism. Now he begins with the classic articulation of the mainline of the Cold War mainline church and the function of the Cold War mainline church. Now don't forget that, well, you might not know this, but church attendance as a function of population reached its height in American history during the Cold War. Now that often surprises people because people often imagine that the history of the church in the United States and North America has been a long, steady decline, but that's not actually true. It actually rises and falls, and its height was actually during the Cold War. And that stands to reason given that the entire nation was mobilized in an existential crisis to fight godless communism. And the implied purpose of the church, therefore, was ethical reinforcement within the Cold War West. The church was there to buttress a communal whole of the civilization in the 50s that had mobilized itself against godless communism, just as the generation before it had mobilized itself to fight the Germans and the Japanese during World War II. Now the psychological value of church, therefore, within that framework was to reinforce ethics, and I think subconsciously the reason you did that in church, and there's, for example, in Washington, D.C., a national cathedral. You would never have that built you would never have that built today. And in fact, if you go into the National Cathedral, you will see the emblems of civil religion. One of the things that we could talk about is that term civil religion, and Robert Bella's essay, which is worth going back and Googling and reading Robert Bella's essay on civil religion. And my thesis essentially is that the Civil War, or the culture war, is a Christendom civil war. And what I'm going to outline here, hopefully not with not too much length, is why this split up after the culture war. So Peterson articulates the implied purpose of the church as ethical reinforcement within the Cold War West, but now there's a psychological value in reinforcing this communally. And one of the big things that Peterson has been helpful to me as a pastor is coming to terms with the roots of that psychological dynamic that church gets into. And before I saw Peterson, I was doing a lot of reading of Jonathan Haidt on that. And he has come to value the Bible in this, but the church doesn't live up to its alarmingly high claims. And you can hear this is in some ways echoes of Jesus was one who taught with authority, and they didn't trust the teachers of the law. You read that in the Gospels. And there's a lot of Jung in Peterson. I'm reading Jung's autobiography right now, and sometimes I'll find quotes in Jung's autobiography that I think, boy, I've heard that out of Peterson I don't know how many times. Now one of the things too that it's important to remember, now Peterson specifically mentions the 1950s here. And again, this is an off-the-cuff answer, so I think in a sense what you're getting from Peterson, again, what I appreciate about him is his transparency and his honesty. And so you're getting an unarticulated kind of, you're getting an archetypal stream from Peterson here. And when he mentioned the 50s, it's very interesting because, of course, the Peterson was born in the early 60s, and so he doesn't even remember the 50s, but the 50s archetypally have come to represent something. And so I took this picture out of a book produced by the Christian Reformed Church, used in its Christian schools during the 50s and 60s, and this picture, in a sense, archetypally represents the ethos of early Cold War American Christianity, and in fact American culture and American moral alignment. If you watch Leave It to Beaver, if you watch Father Knows Best, this was in the American consciousness how America saw itself, represented itself to itself in television, in movies. This was, before the 60s, who we imagined we were and who we imagined should be. And the critical thing to know there is that in the early part of the Cold War, there was complete alignment, Christendom alignment between the church and the civilization, because we lined up behind God. It was during the Eisenhower administration that "In God We Trust" gets put on the coin, that one nation under God gets inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, and so the assumption was that the church's alignment and the culture's alignment, or the church's morality and the culture's morality, were completely aligned. And so you send your children to church, and people go to church in order to get ethically readjusted, kind of like the chiropractor, and set in line. So the church and state and culture are all in a line. Now, a really good book to read about this is George Marsden's The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And George Marsden was a teacher at Calvin College before he moved on. He moved on to someplace else, Notre Dame or Yale. That seems to where all the Calvin College profs who hit it big time go. And I was actually fortunate enough to have George Marsden. I was a history major in college, and I was fortunate enough to have George Marsden as one of my professors. But in this book, he writes about in the late spring of 1960, this is just at almost the turning of the tide. Really, the 50s go from 1945 to 1965, and the 60s go from 1965 to 1975, and they more align with the end of the civil rights movement and the beginning of the Vietnam War movement. But in the late spring of 1960, Life, America's immensely popular pictorial news magazine, again, it's pictorial, that's important here, claiming a readership of 25 million, published a crucial U.S. debate in 5-part series on the national purpose. The authors, a distinguished group including not only professorial observers of the national scene, headed by the legendary Walter Lippmann, but also the men of practical affairs. Sociologists at this point were kind of the gurus of the culture. And so you had all of these luminaries, including, Adlai Stevenson, the egghead who ran for president and got defeated. But also Billy Graham were among the most famous representatives of the major areas of American life. It was unremarkable at the time that all the contributors were white males. It was just as unremarkable that the forum included clergymen, even though the clergyman was an ardent evangelical. And then he goes on to describe who Henry Luce is, who most of us don't know today, but at that point in time was probably the foremost shaper of the culture. Now, I think, again, Peterson knows more than he articulates here, because I took his Maps of Meaning course. And the key thing is that we act things out. And this is, in fact, what he's getting at that answer is church is so crucial if you want to believe the mythology of the Bible. Because what you're doing in church is you're living into the fandom. You're not just you're dressing up to go to see your Star Wars movie. You're deciding which group in Harry Potter's universe, which part of Hogwarts you're going to be. Are you going to be in Hufflepuff, or you're going to be in Slytherin? You know, which ones are you going to embody? And Jonathan Haidt. And I read his books, before I discovered Jordan Peterson, talks about, the circling motion. And Haidt talks about this again and again in his books and in his videos and in his conversation with Jordan Peterson, how this establishes kind of a psychological framework of sanctity. And so it was vital for the American government fighting its war against communism to employ the church, because here we are standing against godless communism and we're aligning all of our institutions together. If you watch, for example, I just watched A Wonderful Life. I usually watch it every Christmas again. Look at the way that church functions as the civil religion. WASPy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, are in many ways the civil religion of the country. And when they built this national cathedral in Washington, D.C., they fill it with emblems of the American civil religion during the Cold War period, lined up to fight the Russians. And so Christendom, Cold War consensus, but then fractures into the current culture war. Now critical in this, the transition, is really the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement becomes the gold standard of ethical behavior in America. And this is where we begin to see the right and the left coming apart. And this is where we begin to see not one civil religion like we had in the Cold War, but I would assert now two civil religions. Progressive liberationism is the new ascendant civil religion of the United States, and to a degree Canada and Western Europe, that are in some ways further down that path. Now the civil rights movement, what it did was critique and really, question that mythic picture of the WASPy American family and all the institutions around it, by shining a spotlight on how African Americans had, for 100 years since the end of the Civil War, been excluded from the American dream. And what is often not noted is that the church was vital in that movement. It's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many of the civil rights leaders were pastors. It's the Reverend Jesse Jackson. But what happens is, again, first you act it out. And so what we see is that we go from a transition of church, home, and school in alignment with the country's ethics and the government agenda, now to a much more fractured society. But now there's a new acting out of what ethics looks like. Ethics used to be going to church and sitting nicely, even if you're Jordan Peterson and can't sit still in church. The transition goes from going to church and sitting nicely and listening to the nice minister talk about ethics, now into acting out ethics in the street. Now again, Marston touches on this. Prior to this transition, Christianity properly understood, and natural science properly understood, and the analytics typically argued, were not at odds. See, it is exactly, there was this consensus, and then in the culture war it split open. Now part of what Jordan Peterson is doing is trying to put them back together. This is crucial. Peterson is trying to remake what was split in the culture war. So the 1950s, Christianity, science, politics, within the civil religion, all meaningfully aligned. Rather, truths of faith and truths of science were complementary in that they dealt with two different realms of human experience. In such a basis, Protestant theologians, of whom Reinhold Niebuhr, you've got neo-orthodoxy here, you have Reinhold Niebuhr, who is one of the most prominent churchmen of the mid-20th century era. Notice how often Barack Obama would quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. That's not an accident. So on this basis, Protestant theologians, of whom Reinhold Niebuhr was the best known, could be prominent voices within the liberal mainstream. In Niebuhr's case, his chastening words regarding the American condition could be welcomed, but his generalized Christianity offered little to challenge most of the secularizing trends that he himself identified. When the consensus culture collapsed in the 60s and 70s, taking with it all but the vestiges of the old Protestant establishment, that collapse initiated, among other things, a religious crisis. And this will set up then the fracturing in the West, in the United States, the rise of the moral majority, the decline of the church, the fissure between science and religion as expressed. All of this gets ripped open then. Formal recognition of Christianity as in public school prayers and observances declined in the same period. Now you have two competing ethical and moral paradigms that are now going to be at play and get fully blown in the culture war. Now again, first you act it out. Why did, I don't know which Jenner this is, but I guess I have no Jenner cred here. I don't know which Jenner this is, but this Jenner does this commercial for Pepsi in which they're a corporation. They're walking some lines here. What they do is they embody the sacred of progressive liberationism. They embody the sacred of the ascendant morality of the left, and they do it in a protest, but the protest is an empty protest. And of course, all the signs are saying, nebulous things about love and peace and justice and all of this, and you get all of the people of the right skin tones together, and of course they're all young because we want to capture this market in their youth, so we'll hook them on Pepsi and have them drink all their life. But then of course this moment that was picked up by Twitter, which was my favorite tweet of the year, hold my wig, Keisha, I got some liberating to do. It's Jennifer. And that tax-free hands, whoever you are, she just nails that moment. And Pepsi gets exposed for dealing with what is sacred to the left, and Pepsi has to quickly pull this off TV. And of course then reports of Jenner being crying and feeling disabused, and it's just playing out in our culture. If I drive from Sacramento to the Bay Area, often I'll take Route 80, and along the way, I notice that there's this statue over a pedestrian bridge over Route 80, and I notice that there are statues among it, and it's a terrible place to try to stop, and one of these days I'm going to have to stop and get my own pictures of this. So I looked it up, and it's Berkeley's Big People statue. And see, again, this is the left. First we act it out, and then we create a representation. And what I noticed, now this is all about protest, but notice the placards are empty. In other words, you can put whatever protest you want to, but the critical thing to notice is the protest. This is the updating of, now if you look at the church, for example, in the Mainline, on the left, the politically left Protestantism, protest for many of them is now the height of their ethical behavior. First you act it out. That's what it looks like. Now, one of the things, now we've dealt with the first question that Peterson dealt with. Let's look at the one about the lying pastors, because this gets into something deep within both the Christian Gospels and then the Protestant Reformation. A couple of summers ago, I went to the Cliff Dwellers in southwestern Colorado, and the docent was explaining to us how the shaman or the holy man, that you put on the mask and you put on the garments, and was explaining to us very secular people that when they would put on the mask and the sacred garments, that the person would become the god. And now right here in our cultural moment, we have all of these issues that Peterson is illuminating, and the issues from which he is drawing his audience. All of these issues get illuminated because we as seculars say, well, how does putting on a mask make you, a normal human being, a god? Well, it does in their cultural imaginary. But we really struggle with that, and we laugh at that, and we despise it because, well, because we know that you take off the mask and he's just a man who has to eat, a man who has to relieve himself, a man who is ethically problematic. And right now we get into the question of incarnation and the Christian story. Now, if you look at the pre-Reformation, the two dominant Christian pre-Reformation traditions, they're heavily involved in materiality, in the Roman Catholic Church, obviously, in transubstantiation, and the bread and the wine become the body of Christ. And again, we can't hear those words anymore in a pre-materialist way. And Peterson, is trying to get at those kinds of ideas. But it's important that these two traditions wear vestments. And when these men who were born of women, who are have their own moral defects and their own moral struggles, but are elevated by their communities as emblematic of what their communities are trying to represent, when they are placed then with the symbols of their office, and when they are robed, they become the representation of the God. And in fact, the split between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic was partially clearly over language. They had, in famous quote, they had a tizzy over a diphthong, and you can Google that if you want to. But also the question was, who represents God? And the Eastern Church said the patriarchs, and in a sense the community does, the body of Christ. The Western Church said it's the heir of Peter who has the keys of the kingdom and sits on the throne of Rome. And that gets into this entire question of the history of the Roman Catholic Church, Constantine, and that whole history. But what I want to point to is now, once they are vested with the clothing and the office, they become the representative of the God, and that then explains the gold, the cathedrals, and all of this representation that happens in historic Christianity. But now if you look at the Protestants, you have to know something happened, but yet not as much happened as we imagine. Now, if one of the things that I like to do, if you want to get into the cultural zeitgeist, is do an image search in Google and see what Google, who probably knows our culture better than we do because they're crowdsourcing it, pulls up. So if I just Google image search mega church pastor, who do I get? Joel Osteen, a health and wealth preacher who embodies. You look at Joel and Victoria, they're young, they're beautiful. Maybe I should be jealous of Joel's hair. He's probably older than me, but looks far younger than me, has far more money than me. He embodies the ideal of his congregation. But now you look at some of the young evangelical megachurch pastors. Do they wear vestments? No. Mark Driscoll is there in a shirt and in some skinny jeans, and he's teaching from the Bible without a pulpit. And Stephen Furtick, another megachurch pastor, and down here we see the conversations about his house. Creflo Dollar. I grew up in, if you know anything about the African American church, you would wonder why all these poor people are really struggling hard to put together money for the Cadillac of their pastor, because the entire church exalts in the affluence of the pastor, even if all the people are poor. Now, generally, waspy white Protestants look at that and they say, "Ooh, that's injustice and that shouldn't be right." But you're not understanding what clergy is, how clergy is supposed to embody the archetype. Now, but the Protestant Reformation comes along and says, "Oh no." Luther says the priesthood of all believers. But you can see these struggles continue to be played out within Protestantism. But then what happens in America? The pedophile priest scandal. And this just, in a sense, this is sealing the deal on the Cold War religious consensus in America, because right there, these priests who wear the vestments of the Lord, who are supposed to embody the ideal, are on the side abusing children, which archetypally, here you are, the highest ideal. The priest wears vestments and embodies the ideal, and then the other, which is just as archetypal, where they are doing the greatest, almost all sexual sins have been recategorized as free expression, except for this one. They are abusing children. So you couldn't imagine a more archetypal issue, which then becomes an archetypal movie where you have the press, which now we're in classic liberalism in the West, the function of the press here to speak truth to power, where the press brings down the Roman Catholic Church. And to sum it all up, this movie, of course, gets the Oscar because they absolutely nail the archetypal moment of the post-Cold War deconstruction of the church. So here we have Jordan Peterson, and he brings in the assumptions that are formed in the Western Cold War about the church, that the church is about ethics and alignment, and we understand the church because of its psychological power. But his lying pastor's complaint echoes the entire sweep of modernity, especially in the Protestant Reformation, as deconstructed the passage of the traditional embodiment, vestments, transubstantiation, to the secular age of authenticity. And if you read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, you read Taylor talking about the reform, how now, instead of having a sacramental church where you could be shrewd in business and even unethical in business, and you could have a wife and a mistress, and you could violate the law all the time, but as long as you go to church, as long as you fulfill the ritual, you sufficiently secure yourself a way to heaven. But there are always tensions within the Roman Catholic Church, and that's where Luther comes in and kind of blows that up. And in that destruction, you therefore have very clearly the iconoclasm movement, where we get rid of all this materiality because we've acted it out, and now we embody and represent it mentally. This is the same transition of the physical blood sacrifice then to, in the Roman Catholic Mass, in a sense, the sacrifice of Christ on the altar, to say the low church Protestant tradition, of which I come out of, where we don't have an altar in church at all. Why? Because the sacrifice of Christ has been completely turned into a mental exercise that has to be displayed then in the ethical practice of my life. All of the roots of this are in the Bible. And when I get into my temple talk on Genesis 1, when I finally get around to that one, I'm going to start fleshing some of this stuff out. So there's hopefully not too long an answer to Jordan Peterson's response to Jordan Peterson's comments about church. I'd love to hear what you have to think, so leave me a comment and let me know.